to Season 2 of Defence Talk, Securing UK Advantage, a podcast brought to you by the Council on Geostrategy in partnership with trade association ADS Group and sponsored by industry powerhouse BAE Systems. This season, we will continue to explore the key questions that shape defence, technological and national security agendas in the UK and unpack the main themes in British defence in the context of intensifying geopolitical competition. Now, it will not be only me guiding you through these questions this season, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by my colleague Paul Mason, a well-known author and journalist, as well as an associate fellow at the Council on Geostrategy. Previously, Paul was the economics editor at BBC Newsnight and later at Channel 4 News, reporting on issues from strikes by the People's Republic of China's migrant workforce to the Arab Spring and other developments all around the world. Paul, welcome.
Well, it's great to be here. And hi to you, Angus. We'll introduce him later. Well, there's a lot happened since the last series of this podcast, and I'm delighted to be here. But what a week we've even had. We're still trying to get our heads around what Donald Trump will do, and in the middle of it all, we've had this intermediate range ballistic missile fired at a Ukrainian city. So we've got a lot to talk about.
Indeed. And actually, the last episode of the previous season ended with a topic on NATO. So I had an opportunity to interview David Quarry, the UK permanent representative to NATO, and Sir Stuart Ather, head of the UK delegation to the NATO Industry Advisory Group. So we've touched on a number of topics that we will continue to talk about in this episode. And since then, there are a couple of developments that have occurred on a global stage. I will mention just a few, and then we can continue the conversation with our guest, Angus Lapsley. So states like China, Iran and North Korea have been increasing their backing for Russia's war against Ukraine. An incoming second Trump presidency has revitalized the debate about the defense spending and potential turn of the US to the Indo-Pacific. And of course, on NATO's periphery, we continuously are facing instability, and it is spreading in Africa as well as the Middle East. So in this challenging context, we are absolutely delighted to have an opportunity today to discuss NATO and the future of European security with Angus Lapsley.
Angus, welcome. I'm going to introduce you. This is the biography I've got for you. NATO Assistant General Secretary for Defence Policy and Planning, and you've been in that role since September 2022. Within the international staff, you lead the team responsible for the Alliance's capability and force planning, posture, plans, and a range of defence policy questions, including nuclear issues. Your background, of course, is well known. You have 30 years as a diplomat, Director of General Strategy and International Ministry of Defence, Ambassador to the European Union, European Union's Political and Security Committee, and you've worked in the private offices of 2 prime ministers. So you are expertly qualified to try and help our audience make sense of NATO's future, the challenges facing it, and of course the UK's role within it. And we should remind ourselves, I'm a Brit, you're a Brit, but you speak here for the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation. Welcome.
Thank you very much, and it's great to be here, and it's great that the Council on Geostrategy is doing this series of looking at these issues.
Thank you so much, Angus. So perhaps we can begin with the current geopolitical developments and how NATO has been reacting to them. What are the key priorities today?
Well, I think it's worth taking a step back at this point and saying that NATO has been around for 75 years, but it has always adapted. It adapted several times during the Cold War to how the threat was changing. Then after the Cold War, it tried to forge a partnership with Russia and moved into stabilizing our region and further afield. We are now in another phase of very serious and profound adaptation as we go back to some of the basics and the essentials of what collective defense means in response to an aggressive, risk-taking Russia that fundamentally, I think, wants to rip up the security order here in Europe. But as you rightly imply in your question, Viktorija, there is a global context to that as well, which is Russia is not acting alone. It's increasingly acting, if not in concert with, and certainly with the implicit support and sometimes the very practical support of other authoritarian regimes around the world. We notice it with China, but of course Iran and North Korea as well in very direct ways. So we are kind of reshaping NATO to look first and foremost at our security at home. That's what the defensive alliance is for, but we have to do so in an increasingly global context.
And is it, At what level of NATO, of the kind of collective brain, insofar as it has a collective brain, at what level do you address the problem of what kind of agent are we dealing with? With China, I always assume we are dealing with a rising power that is thinking, as Leon Trotsky once put it, in centuries and continents. It's got a long-term vision, and it is in that sense rational. What does NATO's collective brain think we are dealing with the Russian security elite? Is it a rational actor?
I think it's a really profound and difficult question, and I think a lot of us in the security world are having to rethink how we think about things. You know, I'm of the generation. The Berlin Wall came down whilst I was at university. That's one of the things that inspired me to pursue the career I did. So we've been through 30 years or so where we in the West felt, you know, we're making history. We're the ones setting the agenda. We're the ones reshaping the world in our image. And now I think we have to recognize that there are a number of actors around the world, as Russia and China in particular, say, no, we're not up for that game. We want to reshape the world in our image. And I think that's profoundly where Russia is today. It doesn't accept the post-Cold War settlement of Europe. It wants to re-establish influence, either direct or indirect, over, you know, whether it's Tsarist Russia or Stalinist Russia. I'm not quite sure where the boundaries are. And it's prepared to act to achieve those goals in very uncomfortable and direct ways. It's prepared to launch large-scale war. And that's I think was the big lesson at the beginning of 2022. But it's also prepared to act sort of below the threshold of war, almost without limit. Assassinations, cyber attacks, interruption of space services, sabotage, mass disinformation, interference in politics, etc. And I think, you know, a lot of analysts now would say Russia thinks it's already at war with the West. So we have to absolutely, as you say, go through a mindset shift and how we deal with that. The most difficult question is kind of what are the limits to that, and is it strictly rational anymore? And you know, that's I don't really feel qualified to answer that. But we as NATO have to make sure we are ready for contingencies that even a few years ago we would probably have thought were very implausible.
I think one of the reasons I ask this, and I always ask people who are in a position to know, is that right down at the nitty-gritty level of military command, the Western way of thinking is that our actions are designed to shape the actions of the other player. And therefore, even, you know, a unit commander is taught to think like this, and they're taught that if you do this and then another thing, you will force the enemy to act in a certain way, which is advantageous to us. And what Ukrainian commanders have said to us is that that's not the way. That's not what happens. You do the things that are in the, as it were, the NATO textbook, and they just keep charging at you with what they call a meat wave of untrained soldiers, and they will just. Nothing we seem to do nothing the Ukrainians seem to do can stop them doing that. So if we then escalate that to the strategic level, we are in a situation where that might be true at the strategic level, and all the assumptions of what your job title, you know, policy and planning, might be wrong.
So I would certainly agree with the analysis that Russia is prepared to throw people, material, resources into an attack in a way that we would find irrational. I think that is absolutely right. But I don't think that means, therefore, that you can't stop them. And I think the Ukrainians would say, do you know what, if you have enough artillery, you can stop them. It's horrible and it's brutal, but, you know, hard force still works. And I think what we try to do as NATO is to think about what is the full what is the full set of instruments that we need at our disposal, not just to stop them, but more importantly to deter them from making that step in the first place. NATO's great success as an alliance is that it has been successful in deterring an attack on our territory over the last 75 years. That is what we are aiming for. That is partly about having physical stopping power, the artillery, the air defense systems, the long-range fires, all those things. It is also partly about psychological pressure, making sure that they understand actually our will to fight, our will to defend is strong. And then it's, if you widen the lens again, it's also about all the other instruments of statecraft that Western powers, and with NATO at their heart, can bring to bear: the economic pressure, the global political pressure, etc. But at the heart of it, we're a defensive alliance, and at the heart of that is good cold steel.
So it's been 1,000 days since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and I would be very keen to learn a bit more about how exactly this ongoing war still has affected the alliance, and particularly I would be interested in understanding more the new force model and the defense industrial plan, something that has been developed since 2022. Could you please tell us more about that?
Yeah, so if you think about what we've been doing as NATO militaries over the last 30 years, we have been essentially doing expeditionary operations. Either enduring ones like in the Balkans or sort of shorter ones like Libya, projecting relatively small forces to go and do relatively low intensity operations. Collective defense is really different. You have to have much larger forces. They have to be positioned geographically where they need to be, or at least at the right time. They have to be able to bring force to bear, and they are going to be fighting against a peer opponent that has nuclear weapons. And also they're going to be fighting at the moment of the adversary's choosing amongst their civilian populations. So there's a whole range of parameters which are really different. So what we are doing, and what we have been doing for the last couple of years, is putting back in place the architecture for that. So it starts with having a strategy. And we have a military strategy that is endorsed by our heads of government. We call it the concept for the defence and deterrence of the North Atlantic area, DDA in NATO speak. Under that fit a whole family of operational plans developed by the military for exactly how they're going to fight particular scenarios. You then have to allocate and organise the forces to fight those plans, and that's what the new force model is. So, for example, rather than asking countries to provide a battalion that rotates through Afghanistan, you say, no, actually, we need a brigade that is ready to be in this bit of Lithuania at this moment with these capabilities. So it's a different way of planning your forces. And then behind all of that, there is a capability demand signal. So to do all of this, we need X number of armoured brigades, we need X number of fighter squadrons, X number of logistics brigades, etc., etc. And that's what we call defence planning. So we are working through reassembling all of that, and that's the essence of the planning challenge that we have in NATO at the moment. And it's what's driving defence spending, it's what's driving demand for people, and lastly, it's what's driving industrial demand. And so what we're trying to do at the moment is match that demand signal of capabilities to people, money, and industrial capacity.
So how does NATO exactly work with the wider defence industry?
So we do this in a number of ways. I mean, primarily, defence industries deal with nation states. They're the people who have the money, they're the people who do the contracting and the force planning. But NATO can help in a number of ways. So firstly, we are working with the national armaments directors of our allies to help them plan collectively, help them understand what the demand signal is, who is going to be picking up what bits of it, and then that means they can have a more sophisticated discussion with industry. We also talk directly to industry as well, help them understand that demand signal. And then NATO has a number of other tools it can use to help make all of that more efficient. So for example, we have a procurement agency which can basically, particularly if you want to buy large amounts of something and several allies want to do the same, that procurement agency, the NSPA, can go off and do that procurement for you, make it more efficient. The other critical thing we do is standards. So we set the standards for this is what a 155mm artillery shell should look like. Now, I think if we're honest,
it doesn't always look like that.
It hasn't always been the case. And one of the things we're therefore doing at the moment is re-energising. The NATO standards process has always been there, but allies have often drifted off and done their own thing. It's time to come back to the family and do things together, so these things are genuinely interchangeable. The last thing we do with industry is promote innovation, because we have a mass problem. We have to rebuild mass.
Let's not be euphemistic about that. It probably means we haven't got big enough stockpiles.
We need stuff.
Yeah, and people.
Yes, we need people and stuff.
And skills.
But we need skilled people, exactly. So we need stuff, we need people, but we also have a modernization challenge that we are going through a phase of, which always happens when great power competition happens. We're going through a phase where new technologies are being exploited and adopted in the defense world at pace. I mean, in Ukraine, it's an astonishing pace. So we have to modernize what we do at the same time. And these things are linked. If you can't find enough people and you haven't got the industrial capacity to build endless tanks, there may well be smarter ways of getting at things through modernization. So hence the importance of encouraging innovation. And we have something called Diana, this incubator, which is based here in London. And we have a NATO investment fund as well, which is helping to grow innovative companies in this sector, because this is critical.
I wanted to just step back to that issue of the, as it were, the overall concept of operations that NATO has developed in response to the obvious threat. In the run-up to the Second World War, I think it was probably true that British fathers and mothers could tell their sons and daughters what was likely to happen in a European war. That is, there will be the territorial army, here it is, we just reinvented it, and it will deploy probably to France. Because that's what happened last time. And lo and behold, that's exactly what did happen pre-Dunkirk. How do you go about communicating, given, of course, we don't want to tell the Russians what our various options are. How do you go about communicating this to the modern population? What the Swedes do it very well. I mean, they just basically say, we will never give in. Here's a booklet. Buy some tins of beans and keep your rifle handy. But how do we go about communicating that here in a country like Britain, which let's face it, there is a contested political space over our commitment to Article 5. There are parties at the fringes of politics that would not favour our Article 5 commitments.
So I think it's certainly true that the closer you are to NATO's eastern flank or northern flank, the more acutely you feel the threat from Russia. And there are certainly countries, the Nordic, Baltic countries, Poland, where that public debate is quite advanced. And there are some like Finland where it never went away.
No.
They always talked about this. And I think it is true to say that the further west you go in Europe, the less publics feel that kind of viscerally. But I think one of the things we have to get across is the nature of modern interstate competition and potentially of conflict is there's no such thing as a rear area. There's no safe space where nothing's going to happen. Things will happen. There are plenty of options, kinetic, as the military would say, or non-kinetic, like cyber and space, etc., where things would happen to countries a long way from the front line in a conflict. So we have to do a bit of thinking and talking about that. But we also have to, I think, it's the fundamental argument for NATO in all Western countries, which is ultimately our security is going to play out on NATO's front lines. That if Estonia or Finland or Romania was under threat, ultimately that threat would come to us. And therefore we have to make sure we are contributing to making sure that threat is deterred, and if it isn't deterred, then stopped and reversed.
And just, you were saying about the demand signal that you're trying to send to the industry. I mean, the assumption is you have to send it first to the big national primes because that's the way the nation states of NATO want to operate. There is, of course, in Ukraine a huge, both at the front, as it were, a fragmentation of the demand signal. It is said that many different units in Ukraine send their demands in different ways. And then our own SME sector here in Britain is responding to those demands. How does NATO, on the defence industrial side, manage that process? Because our own Ministry of Defence is finding it challenging and having to almost scramble new structures, new task forces. Yeah. What are you doing to be able to address that, as it were, the SMEization of rapid innovation?
Yeah, look, I mean, because we are not the actors who actually procure things. At the end of the day, this is something nations have to take on. But we are certainly trying to create that debate. Yeah. And I would actually broaden it a little bit. It's not just the changing nature of the supply chains and the technology drivers in defence. It's also those bits of the private sector who would be very important to the overall resilience of us. So, for example, I met the chief executive of Deutsche Bahn Cargo last week. Why did I do that? She came to speak to all of the national logistics directors in NATO because turns out Deutsche Bahn cargo is going to be incredibly important to whether we can move forces quickly and effectively across Europe.
And anybody who's been on a German train recently will know that it's not the most efficient railway system.
Well, you're not going to draw me on that.
I know, but as a frequent passenger on it, I will tell you that it could do with some improvement.
But so there are a whole range of actors. Telecommunications companies would be another example. The healthcare sector. So one of the things that we are very conscious of is that military medicine has developed over the last 30 years in quite niche ways. Absolutely brilliant at bringing a handful of injured soldiers back from a conflict zone and stabilizing them. Collective defence is a very different demand signal. There you have to mobilise national health services to look after mass casualties, both civilian and military. So the rethinking of this, which frankly it was all there until the late 1980s, it needs rethinking, reinventing and rebooting in place for the modern age.
Procurement is another thing that we've alluded to, but I would be really interested in hearing more from you on whether the existing procurement system within NATO is actually up to the task in this intensifying geopolitical competition context, and most importantly, just the time frames to produce something and to deploy it. They have certainly changed the past couple of years. How has this changed the procurement model, or what other future developments we might expect in this regard?
Yeah, well, again, there's no one NATO procurement model. Every ally does this in their own way, but I think they all face common challenges. There are some things which are always going to take years to develop, design, procure. You cannot go and develop a nuclear-powered submarine in less than a decade. That's just what these things take, because they're incredibly complex. But there are lots of things where we need to move much faster, and also to involve operators in the procurement and design process from the get-go. And this is what you see in Ukraine. You see people who are operating UAV systems on the front line, reaching back directly into the companies who are developing the next iteration of that capability. So that's the kind of thing that allies need to get more comfortable doing. I think there is something about accepting that when you are facing a collective defence challenge, which is by definition an existential challenge, you probably have to take more risk. You have to have more license to fail. I mean, anyone who's sort of looked at the history of Britain in the Second World War, the number of things we tried, and many of which were heroic failures, but no one was no one was criticised for having a go. Whereas the culture we've developed in defence in most Western countries over the last 30 years, if anything goes wrong, parliaments throw their hands up in horror, and the media throw their hands up in horror. We can't have that. Well, I'm afraid people have got to be able to try and fail. Otherwise, we're not actually going to get to a better place.
I just wanted to touch, before we move on from this, on the issue of social resilience. Obviously, you say there's no rear area. There seems to be a very blurred line, certainly in the mind of the adversary, between military and non-military aggression. Anyone who's studied the old Soviet doctrines can recognize this. Going right back to Tukhachevsky, their concept of depth is not a spatial one; it's a social one. They are intend to disrupt the societies that we live in. Now, you mentioned Finland. Finland is an exemplar. The Baltics are exemplary. Finland has a longer history of this. But our own society, it feels quite unprepared. And what can NATO do? Because NATO's imprimatur, its brand, is quite strong. Certainly in Western Europe, it can bring to the national table things that slightly discredited politicians who people are sick of may not do. So what is your role there? And what's the alliance thinking about boosting social resilience?
Yeah, so we're doing this in two ways. So firstly, we have a set of policies which are about making sure that allies think about and plan for broader civilian resilience. So we identify 7 areas: telecommunications, healthcare, mass movement of people, continuity of local government, fuel and energy, transport. And in each of those areas, we have certain planning assumptions. You ought, as a country, to be able to deliver the following things, keep these things going, even in a crisis. And then we do the kind of classic peer review assessment process with allies on that. And there are some allies, like the Scandinavians, who are kind of very well advanced in this. Others, this is a really helpful journey to go through. And we took a very specific decision at the Washington summit in the summer, which was to get all allies to commit to having a process for bringing that civilian planning together with military planning. So it is one thing to plan for natural disasters, pandemics, or whatever. It's a slightly different thing to plan for a scenario in which another state is actively trying to stop you doing these things. And that requires, for example, health planners to sit down with military planners and so on. And that's something we're looking now. This was decided in July in Washington. We will now be talking to all of our allies, including the UK, and saying, right, how are you going to do this? I want to see the mechanisms.
Absolutely. And let's, again, for the avoidance of euphemism, another state is going to try and stop us doing it, and there may be citizens of our own civil society who decide that that's quite a good idea. And in the Cold War, I mean, we're both old enough to remember the Cold War. You can remember.
Viktoria.
I'm on a younger side. Let's put it that way.
Exactly. Yeah. But it was the idea that someone might lock themselves onto the gates of an army base to prevent the vehicles coming out was almost unthinkable. But I'm certain that as we face heightened aggression, there will be situations like that, and it's not NATO's job to tell us how to do that. But you must be able to address the problem that we live in a very different society than the last time we had to do this.
Yeah, although I'm not as old as you, Paul, I'm afraid, but I'm between you and Victoria, just. But I'm old enough to remember that there were parts of our societies in the Cold War who objected to, and Greenham Common. People did train themselves to things. So maybe the Cold War was, we were less confident about the complete integrity of our societies than we now remember. But this goes to the sort of second thing that NATO is trying to do, which is, so if we are on the one hand asking allies to prepare and plan for an exceptional range of things you'd have to do in a collective, you would have to be closing your autobahns and your railways, your airspace, you'd be moving people through, taking over healthcare systems. At the same time, a whole bunch of exceptional things would be being done to you.
Absolutely.
And you've got to prepare for that. So, we talk about this hybrid threat a lot in the Alliance now. We talk about exposing it, calling it out for what it is, basically making sure we understand what's happening. A good example at the moment is intense levels of cooperation amongst Baltic nations to try and understand what is going on with this now pattern of incidents where ships mess with undersea communications cables, etc. So you've got to call it out, you've got to be open about it, and then look at what are the mechanisms we have, either for making things more resilient, making them harder to mess with, or for pushing back and saying that you will pay a price if you carry on doing these things to us that are supposedly below the threshold of conflict. Is
there a reluctance to attribute? I mean, nation states, matter of public record that I was a victim of an FSB attributed cyber attack, and it took 2.5 years for the UK to attribute that for understandable reasons. In the space between, with these cable incidents, let's call them, the space between it happening and the attribution, there's a huge amount of space for disinformation. So is there an understanding in NATO of kind of urgency in being able to attribute?
There's an intense debate about exactly how do you get this right, and as you imply, there are some balances to be struck. Sometimes you may know things, but you don't want to let on that you know things. Sometimes you may want to be cautious about attributing something until you're really certain, because one of the things we have to try and protect is our own credibility. You don't want to say things that then turn out to be wrong, and then the other side says, "Look, told you." They're just the same as us. Now, of course, they're going to say that anyway, but you don't want to put yourself in that situation. So it's a balancing act. But I think there is a broader acceptance across the alliance today. This is part of the problem we face. It's a day-to-day part of it. It would get worse in the run-up to conflict or crisis, and therefore we have to be ready to deal with this collectively.
Let's get back to the recent developments in the US. So the election has just taken place, and the outcome has revitalized the debate about the defense spending within the alliance, and of course also, well, potential refocus of the US on the Indo-Pacific. How this might affect NATO?
Well, look, the US has been underpinning NATO for 75 years, and fundamentally it does it because it's in American national interest to do so. It's obviously very much in our interest as Europeans, but it's fundamentally in American national interest. And I don't think that changes. But what is also true, and it's been true under 3 or 4 US administrations now, of various different political kinds, the balance of military effort required of the US is shifting. And it's clear that the Indo-Pacific is going to be a big driver of American military effort for the foreseeable future. So we as Europeans have to respond to that, especially at a moment when it's clear that the threat has got worse. So my view is, whatever the politics in America, the direction for Europeans is pretty clear. We have to take more responsibility for making sure that we carry our share of the burden in NATO and that we are ready to defend ourselves. It's what you might call a secular trend. And it means having more high-end capabilities. It means having more depth of capabilities. It means being better able to resist the kind of hybrid pressures that we've just been talking about. And it means finding the money and the people and the industrial capacity to deliver all of that.
So how do we encourage that higher defense spending, that higher prioritization across the whole alliance? Because what we've witnessed over the past couple of years and months, of course, well, Poland is on track next year to reach 4.7% of its GDP as defense spending. Baltic states, 3% and above. Whereas there are probably 10 more countries that are still wavering around 2% or even below that. So how do we encourage that all across the alliance?
Well, look, the trend is already in one direction.
That's right.
Defense spending, non-US defense spending in the alliance will have grown by not far off 20% in 2024. That's already quite big money. It's, it's crude terms, it's the equivalent of adding Norway and France to the alliance in terms of extra defense spending in 1 year. So money is flowing in. It's not even across the alliance, and there are certainly some parts of the alliance where I think we're very clear we would like to see defence spending growing faster. I think there is a kind of Nordic, Baltic, Polish drive on capability and investment, which is very, very strong. Then you have the big European countries, France, UK, Italy, Germany, who are growing, but not at the same rate. And there's obviously a lot of pressure on them to do more. And then there are some countries where the debate is still moving, but not moving as fast. Canada would be an example. But the trends are very clearly in one direction. And I think kind of regardless of the American politics, the pressure to, I think it comes back to capability. When you have a set of plans, and you can say to each nation, right, your job in these plans is to do X, Y, Z. Have you got the capability to do X, Y, Z? No, you haven't? Right, so are you going to invest in generating that capability? Because the next bit of the conversation is, if you're not doing your job in the plans, who do you think is? Who are you going to ask to step in and deliver what you haven't delivered yet? And I think that's a different conversation to, we might need to do things in the world, therefore we should have 2% of GDP on defence. It's a more concrete, more real conversation. And the allies, I talk to allies about this constantly. It's a very, very different conversation of allies to where it was a couple of years ago.
And presumably, looking at our own defence landscape here in the United Kingdom, there is a tendency, let me put it this way, to double count. That when you talk to politicians, I don't know about the professional defence planners, but sometimes you get the impression that our armed forces are here to do this here for NATO, but the same assets are also earmarked to do this, and this in the world should we ever need to do it. Do the member states, are the member states stepping up to the plate of realism about what they would actually have to contribute?
Well, there's several things in that. First of all, I would say we recognise allies have one set of forces. and we are now asking them to essentially design those forces around collective defence.
Yep.
But it's perfectly reasonable that they should also have an eye to, could I also use them in other ways? And we have to be realistic about that. It was absolutely the case in the Cold War as well. You always remember Britain retook the Falklands with a force that was designed to reinforce Norway, and it went to the Gulf War in 1991 with a force that was designed to fight in Germany. So there's always an element of flexibility, and in particular for countries like Britain and France that have kind of global responsibilities. The unavoidable fact is everybody is going to need to do more, and you can do this smartly. You can get your procurement smarter. You can use technology smarter. You can use people smarter. In the end, it will cost. And I think we have to be. It's very difficult for us to say exactly what the level of spending for any given country should be. A lot depends on all sorts of national factors. But defence spending in Western Europe during the Cold War was more in the kind of 4 to 5% GDP range. In America, it was in the 5 to 7% GDP.
And that
range.
was the norm back in the day.
And that
was
the
acceptable.
norm. I don't think many of us are saying we have to go back to that level of defence spending. But where we are now is probably not enough in most European countries.
So looking to the future, Angus, no matter how hostilities end in Ukraine, and of course the war is still ongoing, the key question is, what are the essential components to a stable and peaceful Euro-Atlantic, free of Russian aggression? What's the answer in your view?
Look, I would argue, I think most people in NATO would argue that European security is going to be under a lot of pressure unless the war in Ukraine ends with a secure, stable Ukraine that is able to defend itself. And that probably means in the end that it needs to be part of NATO, and that's very much what our corporate view is, and that's what the Secretary General's view is. How you get there is obviously going to be very tough. Right now, it's clear that allies have to be supporting Ukraine in the fight they're in, and we've been very clear on that over the last 2 years. We've recognised that allies are having to divert some of the resource that they would otherwise spend on themselves to Ukraine, but that is absolutely the right thing to be doing in the circumstances. If we end up with a Ukraine that is not sovereign and secure, we will not be secure, and the problems and therefore the costs to NATO will be higher. So our challenge starts with Ukraine's challenge.
Angus, it's been an absolute pleasure to welcome you as our guest for the very first episode of season 2, and Paul, also to welcome you as my co-host for the season.
It's been a great conversation, I think. Thank you.
Thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you.
Wonderful. And thank you so much to our listeners for listening to Defence Talk Securing UK Advantage, brought to you by the Council on Geostrategy in partnership with ATS and sponsored by BAE Systems. If you would like to submit a question for our next episode, please email them to defencetalks@geostrategy.org.uk, and you can find all our upcoming episodes on our website, and please visit www.geostrategy.org.uk/defencetalks. Thank you, and until next time.
Goodbye.